So I just finished this work here. This is by Edward Bellamy. It was called Looking Backward. And it was written in 1888. And I thought I'd give just a brief review of this book. I would say this book is probably one of the most crucial texts to read if you want to understand socialism, capitalism, communism. If you want to understand the state that we're in now, I think this is one of the crucial books to read. It is also a very badly written book, boring as anything. It's really badly written. Edward Bellamy was a 19th century man, and with his cousin, I believe it was his cousin, he was one of the progenitors of the eugenics movement in America. And he wrote several novels. This was considered his masterpiece, and it includes most of his thoughts about the way civilization should be. The basic premise of the book is that a man falls asleep due to hypnotism, and he doesn't wake up until the year 2000. He falls asleep in 1888. He sleeps for 100 plus years, wakes up in the year 2000. So it's a bit like a Rip Van Winkle story in a way. But in the year 2000, Bellamy then creates a utopian society, a society that's absolutely perfect in every way possible. And at least that's according to Bellamy. And this book would not be, this badly written book would not be such a big deal if, on the one hand, it didn't have such a tremendous influence on people in America and in Europe, quite frankly. The book was popular in its day. I think I read somewhere that it was so popular that the only thing that surpassed it in terms of publication sales was the Bible. It was really quite the hit, which is surprising because it's such a bad book. It's really poorly written. It's kind of like, the main character goes into the future, he wakes up and he talks with this fellow, Dr. Leet, and most of the book is he and Dr. Leet, the main character's name, I hate to forget his name, Julian West. Julian West and Dr. Leet talk, and Dr. Leet puts forth all of the principles that organize their society. So Julian West asks questions, Dr. Leet responds with these very long excursi on how their civilization in the year 2000 is organized now. How it's so much better than the 19th century situation. And occasionally Dr. Leet's daughter also talks with Julian West. They'll walk and have a meal and then talk for 5 or 6 pages, and maybe they'll go to a supermarket or to a show and then talk for 6 or 7 pages after that. And everything is sort of surrounding these discussions about how superior their civilization in 2000 is to the civilization of 1888. It's sort of like the Phantom Menace of the 19th century, okay? People walking and talking, very little action at all. The only action really is him falling asleep and then waking up, and then I think they have a meal or two, and eventually he marries the daughter of Dr. Leet. The daughter has, ironically, the same name as the fiancé of Julian West in 1888, so, that's convenient and all that. In the copy that I read from the library, I started reading this from the library before I got my own copy, because I wanted to mark it up. The copy from the library has a really good introduction, which really pillories the author, Edward Bellamy. Bellamy apparently passed the bar but never practiced law, and he tried college, but that didn't work out for him, and eventually he went and lived in his parents' basement, maybe their attic, where he wrote most of his stuff. And that's how interesting. He's sort of kind of like, I guess, the incel of his day. But he ends up writing this tremendous treatise, this thick piece of fiction, which is a bit of a Platonic dialogue, really, but not as interesting as the Platonic dialogue. And he sets forth this utopian society that then influences so many people in America that Bellamy societies were actually formed where people could get together and discuss his ideas and how to implement them by the year 2000. You got to think about that for just a minute. This work created in the minds of people a vision of what the future could be in 100 years, if only they worked hard for it. To work for a new world order, unlike anything else that had come before. A world order of prosperity and health and human happiness and everything you could possibly want materially, and everybody working happily in their jobs. That was the vision that was instilled in all these people that formed these Bellamy societies and then went out to try and improve things and make the world what Bellamy suggested it should be. The thing that Bellamy really did in America too was he created the National Socialist Party in America. The National Socialist Party in America. I think his magazine was called the Nationalist, I think it was called, or The Nation, but he published a magazine where he put forth ideas, his own and other ideas that corresponded. And the National Socialist Party in America goes on to make reforms in America and throughout the world, but in America primarily, that tended towards socialism. So they increased socialism in America. And what does that mean? Because it's not communism, right? It's socialism. Socialism was where the government basically controlled all business. Business and government were the same thing. There was no separation between business and government. Now, in the future that Bellamy constructs, this is an ideal. Government and business are the same thing. In fact, the President of the United States is the CEO of the one company that creates and distributes all the goods that people could possibly want. And all those goods that people could possibly want are stored in warehouses in these small cities where basically everything is within walking distance of your home. And then you push a button or you order on a menu and the goods and products that you want are delivered directly to your door. In this book, Bellamy offers a number of different really interesting ideas, science fiction at the time. But let me put forth a few and see if they sound familiar. He is the first one to say, really, that you can have music piped into your home that's played somewhere else. And if you don't like the music, you switch the channel on the machine. This is in an era before radio. There's no radio in 1888. So think about that. Bellamy is proposing a radio in this work. He also proposes that every citizen is issued a card that has a certain amount of credit on it, and the credit then they use to purchase the products they need during the course of the month. And when they use up that credit, they can't purchase any more products. But the credit is basically estimated by the government to be appropriate to what a citizen should need. The government company, corporation, whatever you call it. That is strikingly familiar. It sounds like a credit card. And Bellamy in 1888 is proposing a credit card. He proposes this idea of storehouses of goods stockpiled. Now that had been around, of course. There had been, stockpiles of woolen goods or stockpiles of material goods, wood and steel and things like that. Even stockpiles of food that existed. But what he adds to that idea of stockpile is the stockpile is then delivered directly to your door when you order it with the push of a button. If you are not familiar with Amazon, you've been living under a rock, because in the last 20 years, Amazon and other companies like it that have followed suit have done precisely this thing. Bellamy proposes it in 1888. Now, in addition, Bellamy also proposes that the stockpile is not an individual company, but it is the government company. That the government company basically produces, as I said, and distributes the goods that people desire. And when they don't desire them anymore, those goods are phased out. And as people suggest they need this, the government produces it and then delivers it. And the government basically takes care of your health care, and it takes care of your material goods, and it takes care of your entertainment, and it takes care of your education. And the government corporation is in charge of everything. The novel also suggests that individuals basically are more free than individuals in the 19th century because they have given themselves over to the government and they no longer have to worry about any of their material goods. So individualism, Bellamy suggests, is kind of vanquished because individualism depends on the disparity of material goods between people. And when you get rid of that disparity between material goods between people, you don't have individualism anymore. Every man is equal to every other man. Every woman is equal to every woman. Every woman is equal to every man. Every man is equal to every woman. He suggests in this book that there is almost like a surgeon general, not a commandant, that's not the right word, but a leader of the women too, and she organizes women in the workplace alongside men. He also suggests that everybody has to work, that everyone is required by the government corporation to work from a certain age to a certain age. I don't remember what it was exactly. I think it's 18 to like 45, and they all retire at 45. But everybody has to work. And he doesn't deal with those that don't work, except for one small passage where he says that they, I think they get arrested and they get put into a jail until they see the error of their ways, something to that effect. But he does suggest that work itself is encouraged by everybody, every other citizen. So other citizens shun those who don't work, and women choose men that are healthy and strong and want to work, and they shun men and accuse men, pillory men, abuse men, so to speak, who don't want to work. So everybody, like by the social impetus, by this social pressure, is required to work. Now, it's nice in the novel, everybody gets to choose a job that they're suited for, and their talents are correctly employed, and everybody has an education that guides them in the direction in accord with their talents, so that they get a nice, happy job where they're happy, and then they get credit on their credit card. But everybody has to work. Working is synonymous with life until you're 45, and then you have leisure until you die. Bellamy also talks in this work over and over again about the strength of the human stock, the purity of the race, the purity of the genes of the race, filtering out the weaker, filtering out the defective, filtering out all those who don't fit in. So there's a lot of gleaning of human weakness in this book, hinted at or even talked explicitly about, but he never goes into full detail about what exactly they do with all those people. You know, that, I guess he leaves that up to the Bellamy societies here and in Germany to decide. But the book is rife with that sort of like highfalutin intellectual purity of race that is so noble and strong and healthy and virtuous. And really, it's a utopian society in that sense. It's strange. It's written like 7 years before The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells, who creates The Time Machine, that two classes of Eloy and Morlocks, probably was responding to something like what Bellamy was writing, at least to some degree. The thing that I find most insidious here, there's the passage, of course, about how do you deal with slackers, but there's this passage too right near the end of the work where there's a sermon that they get to hear by the radio, and the sermon is sort of a patting themselves on the back and rah rah, aren't we great? And the whole sermon is sort of our year 2000 socialists utopia is so much better than everything that came before it. Very little talk about human virtue or human weakness or human sin. But there are two things here that really just got me at the end of this. Oh, and by the way, it all works out nicely because Julian West gets to marry young Edith Leete, and they live happily ever after in this socialist utopia in America, in Boston. So, right at the beginning of this sermon by Mr. Barton, the other sermon they could have chosen is a Mr. Sweetser, so they choose Mr. Barton. And right at the beginning, Edith says to her father, she whispers to her father, and he turns to Julian West, and he says, Edith suggests that you may find it slightly embarrassing to listen to a discourse on the lines Mr. Barton is laying down, and if so, you need not be cheated out of a sermon. She will connect us with Mr. Sweetser's speaking room, if you say so, and I can still promise you a very good discourse. No, I said, believe me, I would much rather hear what Mr. Barton has to say. As you please, replied my host. When her father spoke to me, Edith had touched a screw, and the voice of Mr. Barton had ceased, abruptly, because it's coming through the radio, right? Now, at another touch, the room was once more filled with the earnest, sympathetic tones which had already impressed me most favorably. And they go on with this sermon of Mr. Barton's. Now, what's really kind of gets me is that after all this book, and there's a lot in here when you're reading this, it's a 140-some, 50-some pages. There's all this talk about this socialist utopia and how everything is made perfect and how the machinery just works in perfect accord with humanity and everybody has to work and they're happy in their work. It's all this talk about that. And even religion at the end becomes a sort of arm of the state. It's designed in order to reassure people that what they have is the best thing ever. What it doesn't do is it doesn't talk about human sin, human failing, human frailty, how to recover from that. It doesn't talk about how Christ died on the cross for us. It doesn't talk about sacrifice. It doesn't talk about suffering and torture. None of that, okay? And all that would be very disturbing. And gee whiz, it'd be awful to hear that in your socialist utopia. So you get to turn it off with the click of a button. Yay! Anything that would run contrary to your happy socialist program can be turned off with a click of a button. Now, maybe that got me because what are we seeing now in our current society in 2023, 23 years after when the socialist utopia was supposed to have come into existence? We're seeing in some ways the ability of people to live within an echo chamber, the ability of people to simply turn off things that are disturbing, to not have to see the disturbing things of life at all. And I'm not talking about like disturbing political views, or I'm not talking about, aborted babies, or I'm not talking about child sex trafficking. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, the basic things of life, of birth, conception, death, the raising of animals, for instance, we don't do in our modern society. Animals appear on the shelf at Martin's in a package of saran wrap. We don't see the world of the animals. We don't see the hard labor that people go through. We don't have to deal with difficult questions in our textbooks because they've been excised. We don't have to look at what people in past generations went through because history's been rewritten. We are insulated now from anything that might disturb us from our possible socialist utopia. And so this passage really got me. It's like, that's happening even now, right? That's happening even now that we have this idea of the socialist utopia that can't be disturbed by the hard facts of the world. That essentially in the world, people suffer and make mistakes and get addicted to things and abuse one another and feel pain and have to find some way to redemption. No. Not if everything is equal. Not if we have equal access to goods. If the government has control of us and takes care of us, there's no suffering. The idea that humanity can be fixed, that's what it is. Humanity can be fixed and perfected. And golly, do they ever perfect it. This was the other passage that really got me. This is right at the end of this long sermon of patting themselves on the back. And the preacher here, by the way, Mr. Barton, is one of those insufferable preachers, and that seems to be the whole essence of religion, is to listen to some insufferable slob tell you how great you are and how great the world is. And he says, it is very easy to believe in the fatherhood of God in the 20th century, right? Because we have everything we can possibly need. All material wants are taken care of by the government. So it's very possible to believe in the fatherhood of God. God, in this sense, is a God that provides for our material good. Yeah. Briefly, as must needs be in a discourse of this character, he says, I have adverted to some of the causes which have prepared men's minds for the change from the old to the new order, as well as some causes of the conservatism of despair, which for a while held it back after the time was ripe. Right? To wonder at the rapidity with which the change was completed after its possibility was first entertained is to forget the intoxicating effect of hope upon minds long accustomed to despair. The sunburst, after so long and dark a night, must needs have had a dazzling effect. From the moment men allowed themselves to believe that humanity, after all, had not been meant for a dwarf, that its squat stature was not the measure of its possible growth, but that it stood upon the verge of an avatar of limitless development, the reaction must needs have been overwhelming. It is evident that nothing was able to stand against the enthusiasm which the new faith inspired. That's what this whole sermon's like. It's like this god-awful stuff. And, then he concludes his little sermon here with a paean, if I can find it, a paean to humanity. There's a parable of this. He says, the betterment of mankind from generation to generation, physically, mentally, morally, is recognized as the one great object supremely worthy of effort and of sacrifice. We believe the race for the first time to have entered on the realization of God's ideal of it, and each generation must now be a step upward. Do you ask what we look for when unnumbered generations shall have passed away? I answer, the way stretches far before us, but the end is lost in light. For twofold is the return of man to God, who is our home, the return of the individual by the way of death, and the return of the race by the fulfillment of the evolution, when the divine secret hidden in the germ shall be perfectly unfolded. With a tear for the dark past, turn we then to the dazzling future, and veiling our eyes press forward. The long and weary winter of the race is ended. Its summer has begun. Humanity has burst the chrysalis. The heavens are before it. God, makes me want to puke. My father used to take books like this and chuck them across the room. Why does it make me want to puke? Because so many people believed it, believed that humanity was perfectible, believed that the future was going to be bright and glorious, and that science would help us, and that God would conform to our will and look down on us, pleased that we have every material good taken care of. And how will we get there? How would we get there? We'd get there by purging humanity of all the people that were backward or who were misshapen or retarded or handicapped or of different sexual persuasions or of different religions or of different races. We'd purge them and we'd purify the stock. And then, having purified the stock, we would have great vistas of clean streets and great architecture, and we would have great entertainment and art that would emerge. We'd get rid of any Antarctica Kunst that we didn't like. And we would have people in droves realizing with their physical self taken care of through medicine and science and everything they could possibly want, realizing that government was our benign friend, and giving themselves over completely to it. That is the vision of Edward Bellamy. And it's a vision that was so attractive here in America that the National Socialist Party in America was a very, very, very popular movement. They invented, for instance, and this is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, they invented the Pledge of Allegiance. The National Socialist movement in America invented the Pledge of Allegiance. And all the schools adopted it. And little kids were saying, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. The whole passage of God was inserted later, actually, into that pledge. And they were pledging, to the flag, but they weren't pledging like this. And if you look at photos, this is a buried piece of history. They were not pledging this way. They were pledging like this, with the Roman salute, pledging to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God. What do you make of that? Does it disturb you at all? Does it disturb you at all? It disturbs me. That in German, National Socialist Party is Nationalsozialistische Partei, short to Nazi. See, the Nazi movement in America was a real thing, a very powerful, real thing. Here in England, in Germany, in Italy, they all subscribed to the idea of utopianism, that man could be perfected through socialism and government would be the benefactor of man. And the Germans especially pushed to try and make it happen, so much so that they thought, they documented every single thing they did. They documented it because they thought future generations would thank them for what they were doing. They documented the warehouses, the architecture, the movement of troops, the Hitler Youth. They documented the death camps where they were purging all of the Jews and all of the other undesirables. They documented the experiments that doctors were doing on people in order to perfect science. They documented the creation of the rockets and the work on the bomb that they were doing. All this, they documented this because future generations would thank them when they made the Reich that would last for 1,000 years. This is important to read, partly because it was a movement that changed America, and partly because it was the thing, I think, that was the granddaddy of Nazi socialism, National Socialism, here and in Germany, that caused World War II, at least, maybe World War I to some degree, but World War II certainly. But it's also important to read because it hasn't gone away. What do you think the whole movement to make one world government is about? What do you think the whole movement to make one company, one corporation, a Time Warner Disney Corporation united together, what do you think that's all about? Is it possible that the people that are trying to perfect the world through science, that are trying to destroy the economy in order to buy it up quickly, the people that are trying to unite the government entirely are perhaps influenced by this guy's vision of creating a utopian future? Maybe. I think yes. And I think reading such works allows us to understand better what we're going through today. So I highly encourage you, read Edward Bellamy, find out about Edward Bellamy, read Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, 1888. Read it with a grain of salt. You're going to want to take a lot of breaks. It's boring, but it's exciting as anything when you look at the ideas and how those ideas have influenced us in very sinister ways. I thank you. And I look forward to doing future reviews, maybe of this guy here, F.A. Hayek. We'll see. God bless y'all.